Every console has great games and terrible games, and in this week's show we're going to be looking at the worst fighters that you can get on the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. My name's Mike, and this is the Retro Gamer Boy Show. Now this is your first and last warning, because we're going to be looking at the worst of the worst fighters that you can buy for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. And as you go through this list, if you think anything needs to be higher or lower in the list, or something's been forgotten, make sure you drop down into the comments below and let us know what you think should be in this top 10. Coming in at number 10, we have Balls, and it's balls by name and balls by nature. The game is an interesting tech demo, but it lacks any key ingredients of any good game: fun. The combat is very loose and kicks and punches don't feel impactful. The lack of connection between my action and the response from the game remove the feeling of skill. Jumping is particularly bad, and the abstract nature of the characters just doubles down on how loose the combat feels in this game. We can disagree on the character art, but we're not going to disagree on the background art, which is just terrible. The audio continues this abstract theme and rounds off this underwhelming, dull fighter. Deadly Moves is an interesting fighter that wants to emulate one of the biggest franchises ever made. It allows you to play with only a single character and tries to shoehorn in some RPG elements. The soundtrack, moveset, and even some of the characters feel like a poor man's knockoff of Street Fighter 2. It's impossible to play through this game and not at some point think, hey, did they just do a dodgy traceover of Street Fighter 2? But saying that, the visuals are okay, the characters are competently drawn, and there's some variety in the backgrounds showing that some thought went into this game. The combat is acceptable but not great, and it often feels like I'm fighting against the controller. There is little fluidity to the combat, meaning chaining moves together comes rarely. The AI is also overly aggressive, making the game hard to get into for new players. Next, we have Thunder Pro Wrestling Retsuden, and apart from the portrait pictures at the character selection screen, this game looks and sounds like a decent Master System game. Now, I can look past visuals if the gameplay is great. Unfortunately, whilst there are a decent number of moves in the game, many of them are contextual, so they only happen depending on the situation your character finds themselves in. It is also hard to pull off some of the moves, especially when compared to the AI that has no issues at all and can get the upper hand on a grapple with no obvious reason why. Fighting Masters sees 12 races fighting to save their worlds from a sun that's about to go supernova in a matter of hours. The presentation in this game is very simple, with fighter selection and versus screen dull and simplistic. There's a decent selection of characters and character design, but the character designs are the best bit of the game. Controls have you contorting your fingers around the pad as you grapple with the slow responding controls. Attacks are very simple and not satisfying, consisting of basic punches and kicks. The characters slide across the screen in Arena, and the combat is no better than that found in Golden Axe 2 in its hand-to-hand combat sections. There is variation in the backgrounds, but it's rubbish, and the sound is terrible. Street Smart was an aging game when it came to the Sega Genesis and looked dated compared to games coming out on the system. The visuals were technically good, but were lackluster compared to what Sega 16-bit fans were after. The combat in the game is very floaty, punches and kicks don't feel like they make contact, and there's no player collision, so you can end up with the players standing on top of each other, punching and kicking and hitting nothing. At the end of each successful fight you can upgrade your stats like health and power. There's also a system for placing bets on your character or your opponent. This is another fighter where the aggressive AI can make it hard to enjoy. The most redeeming part of Beast Wrestler is its name and the variation in character sprites. It's all downhill from here. The controls are not very responsive and will leave you frustrated. The combat often ends up being a button-bashing affair with very little in the way of combos or specials. What compounds the poor combat mechanics are the abstract beasts. Characters that don't have the traditional 2 legs and 2 arms can be awkward to fight against. The Blob is a great example of this. The sound design is the bare minimum and the background art is dull and simple. Any of the games that are about to follow could easily take the #1 spot for worst fighting game. For the longest time, Time Killers was for me the worst fighter on the Sega Mega Drive, but over time I've been treated to much worse, and so now Time Killers finds itself at #4. Let's start off with the character art that was drawn by 7-year-olds using MS Paint blindfolded. The characters are some of the worst drawn sprites I've seen. The combat is loose and simple, and the feature of cutting off body parts has little bearing on the fight as long as you keep up your attacks. The AI is inconsistent, with you getting a flawless victory in the first fight, only to have the AI destroy you in the second round before you spank it again in the third round. Backgrounds vary from terrible 2 out of 10s to a solid 5 out of 10. The audio design is not bad, but it's not good enough to redeem this terrible game. Now, many of you may think that this next game is the worst fighting game that you can buy on the Sega Mega Drive and Genesis. But believe me when I say that the worst game has even worse mechanics and worse implementation than the game we're about to see. Rise of the Robots. I remember queuing up to buy this game. It received a ton of PR and marketing and was billed as one of the best fighters ever. But magazines were not allowed to review the game until after its launch, and it was clear why. Luckily, I was saved from spending a ton of cash on this game as I played it in the store while I waited in the long queue to buy it. The pre-rendered characters are cool, but the robot designs are bland. And this is the best thing about this game. Combat is slow and sluggish. You can defeat enemies with a single attack. Jumps are poor and movesets are rigid. The sound design is terrible and you're stuck playing the same character throughout the game. Slaughter Sport. Where to start with this game? It's one of the worst attempts at a fighting game ever. The combat gameplay, if you can call it that, is terrible. You will spend your time jumping back and forth over your enemy, randomly pressing punch and kick in the vain hope of hitting your enemy. I say hope because the collision detection in this game is close to non-existent. There is no joy to be had when playing this game. You can blow fire and use special moves that prevent your opponent from jumping, but these are useless. The backgrounds and character art are dull and low effort, with the only redeeming feature being the game's main villain, 𝗏𝗺𝗶𝗴𝗃's intro screen. We finally got to the worst fighting game on this Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. Luckily for power owners, it never made it to their console. It's 𝗵𝗺𝗺𝗏. 𝗵𝗵𝗺𝗏 is not just one of the worst fighting games ever, but one of the worst games ever. This is a game of two halves. The first half is a terrible attempt at a platform stage, but this is not a platform game. The platform stage is designed to wear down your health, but also give you the opportunity to collect power-ups for the core game, the fighter. This platforming element is torture, poor traversal mechanics, atrocious level design, and dreadful enemy AI. It's useless and only serves to frustrate the player. But this is not the worst part of the game, oh no. The fight that follows, the main event, is a sluggish mess of poorly implemented combat, huge game-breaking design, and visuals that they should never have graced Sega's 16-bit console. So those are my top 10 worst fighting games for the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive. Now remember to drop down into the comments below and let me know what your top 10 worst fighting games are for Sega's 16-bit console. Now if you've enjoyed this episode, if you love your Sega Genesis and Mega Drive, if you just love retro gaming, then why not consider subscribing? You can do this by clicking on a little button just below this video. We put out brand new videos every single Monday, and so that you don't miss them, make sure you also hit the little bell, also just below this video. Now if you can't wait till Monday, don't worry, because we have a huge back catalogue of retro gaming videos for you to enjoy, 2 of which you can watch over here.